Good evening. My name is Elizabeth Aaliyah. This is my second AV log, and the topic I have decided to focus on for this is kind of based upon the article we read called "The Places in the U.S. Where Disaster Strikes Again and Again," and that's kind of in reference to hurricanes. This is the primary aspect that article focused on, but it has seemed, especially increasingly in the last several years, that we have faced event after event that kind of devastated certain local communities, ranging from wildfires, up in the Pacific Northwest, and the hurricanes in the South, and flooding, different things. It just seems like, our emergency response has been somewhat overwhelmed, and so I wanted to focus on this for my AV log because, these are places that, these are not isolated events. These are events that are taking place that are recurring. You can expect certain times of the year in Florida, there are probably going to be hurricanes. So, kind of starting with some background, this is a textbook. I used it in another class, I think it was last semester. It's called Hazard Mitigation and Preparedness, and it kind of gives some interesting backdrop on the decision-making process for businesses as far as coastal development, and just kind of the factors that play a role in whether or not they choose to invest in those areas, because it has to make sense economically to them, from the cost risk analysis. And so the first thing they look at is demand. Whatever their business or organization is there a demand in that local area to support them? And then also risk. So in our perspective, that would be vulnerabilities. What are the potential vulnerabilities or hazards that could be faced that could wreak havoc on the longevity of the said business or organization? And then also regulation, because depending upon the nature of your business or organization, different regulations would be in place. If you're a plant, you might have to follow certain regulations for disposal, and that could be costly. Also infrastructure, the availability of that, and just the different aspects that play a role in that, and the time value of money. So these are just kind of some of the things that this textbook, written by numerous different professionals, noted as important factors for, business owners or organizations. So this is not something that's not being noticed. Even from an economic perspective, business owners or organizations, whatever the case may be, they understand that there are risks associated. Now, people not, professionals not in this line of industry might understate the risks associated. Here, we're not very likely to experience an earthquake, perhaps. So obviously we wouldn't be considering that, but a tornado, extreme thunderstorms and hail, flooding, those are some things that we very likely could experience, and it's important to know that, and make sure you take the correct precautions and mitigation aspects and insurance, because that's a whole another issue. My second resource that I use for this is a little more in line as far as the hurricane season, and it's an article from a website called Think Progress, and the title is FEMA Admits It's Short a Few Thousand Employees as Hurricane Season Begins, which is not a very settling thought, and that is of the 13th of this June, so it's very recent. And I'm just going to touch on a few points that I thought were of particular note. FEMA said that they are still significantly understaffed nearly 2 years after the recovery efforts during the devastating 2017 hurricane season. And it states their understaffing as one of the contributing factors as to their poor response. And so that's been 2 years ago, and that was the factor that was attributed to their lack of response, or I guess good response, according to the media and other organizations. And so 2 years later, and they still have the same issue. They're saying they're understaffed regarding part-time employees, which are critical to addressing disasters and wide-scale crises, which you can never, I guess, predict necessarily when the next, devastating disaster will occur. You don't know if tomorrow there's going to be an absolutely devastating earthquake in the Northwest. You don't know that there's not going to be whatever kind of disaster you want to name. It could happen. And as part of emergency management, you plan for something that you hope doesn't happen. You take a look at the vulnerabilities, but these are not unexpected necessarily, because hurricanes are a recurring issue there. I mean, it's a vulnerability that they're very aware of. It's not something that takes them by surprise every season. We call it hurricane season. We call it tornado season. It's because these things have seasons. They're recurring. They happen consistently. And so it's just interesting, this vulnerability that we have and the issue attributed to a poor performance in the past is still an issue years later. And if you want to take a further look at this article, you can find it online from Think Progress. It was written by an E.A. Crunden. So take a look at it. It's really interesting. It's got a lot more details about it. It kind of goes into some of the political atmosphere as well. And I hope you learned something from this. Thanks.